Hello everyone. So today we are going to have a hands-on session on AWS Lambda destinations. This is quite a new feature where this is specifically for asynchronous Lambda invocations. So whenever you execute a Lambda function asynchronously, the caller gets the response back immediately, but internally the Lambda will maintain its own internal queue and then execute the Lambda function appropriately. So, in case this Lambda function is success or failure, there are some ways to track it using dead letter queue or doing some additional coding. But this AWS Lambda destinations will allow you to just set the destinations for success or failure of those asynchronous Lambda invocations. It could be either another Lambda function or SQS or SNS or event bridge. And then Lambda will send the event or message to that destination. Okay, the first step is to create application Lambda function. So I'm in AWS console in Lambda services, create function. I will give a function name as Lambda app. So select version as Python 3.13, that is latest, and create function. So the function is ready. Um, I have a existing code that we can use. So in the repository, I will share the link in the description. There is a file called as lambda app.python. So I will get the code from here. Okay, so what this code is doing is it is simply printing the first message outside the handler. Then it's printing the actual event, and the event has three fields: the transaction ID, type, and the amount. And in case the transaction ID is empty, it is raising an exception. So this is how we can simulate a success or failure of the Lambda execution. So we can test this function. We first deploy, and in the test I will create one test event. So in the repository there is another file, inputs.json. So this is the success input where I have a transaction ID. I'll give the transaction ID, save this event as event 1, and test. So if you see here, the execution is successful and it is responding with all those details on a single line. And then I will create another event, event 2, where I will give the input that causes the exception in the Lambda. Save as event 2 and test. Yeah, and now you'll see that Lambda failed with error message empty transaction that is coming from our code, the empty transaction ID. Okay, so our application Lambda is ready. Next, we are going to create the destination Lambda that will be called in case of our application Lambda fails. So click on create function. The name I'm giving is Lambda destination failure. I'm going to use Python because that's a code that I have. So in the repository, there is a lambda dest failure.python file. So I'm going to take the code from there. So in the Lambda console, replace the default code with our code. So this is even simpler code. We are just printing the event that we get from the Lambda. I will deploy this Lambda. And I will skip testing because this is very simple Lambda function. Okay, so we have our both the functions created. You can ignore the first one. So we're going to add a destination for this application function. So click on the Lambda app. Under configuration tab, there is a destinations section. From here you can add destination. So under the source, you select asynchronous invocation because that's the one that we are going to try. The condition is on failure. The destination type, it could be SNS topic or SQS queue or some other Lambda function or event bridge, event bus or a S3 bucket. So I'm going to select Lambda function. Here you can paste the URL or select the destination function from dropdown. You cannot use the same function, that might create a loop. So you have to select a different Lambda function. Under permissions, this will be selected by default so that Lambda service can update required permissions for the Lambda execution role. Click on save. Yeah, and you have the Lambda destination defined for any failures for this function. Now let's do the actual execution and see whenever our application Lambda function fails, it's going to call a destination Lambda function. So in the repository, I have inputs.json file. Um, it's not actually JSON, but it just has all the required inputs that you can use. So I have AWS Lambda call, the CLI that you can invoke to call the application Lambda function. So the first one we are going to call the success case where we are calling the Lambda app function with invocation type is event. So that is going to call this function asynchronously, and the payload which has the transaction ID some value. That way it's a valid payload. So I'm going to copy this line. Okay, so from the CLI I'm going to invoke this. I have AWS CLI configured. You may need to configure it before you run this command. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, whenever you call the function asynchronously, it just going to return you the status 202. That means it accepted the response. So going to the AWS console, all the Lambda executions by default log to CloudWatch logs. So you can go to the CloudWatch log service. If you refresh the log groups, you will see a new log group created for Lambda app. Inside the log group, there will be multiple log streams. So there will be a first log stream that got created for my latest version of the Lambda. And in the logs, you can see the actual messages that I'm printing from the Lambda function. But if you go to the log groups again and try to refresh, you will not see any logs created for a destination Lambda, because that Lambda never got executed because the application Lambda function was successful. So now we are going to simulate a failure case. For the failure command, I have everything same except the transaction ID. So I don't have any value for the transaction ID. So that way the application Lambda will fail. So I will call the failure case. Okay, the Lambda invocation has been accepted. So if I go to the logs, it is still calling the application Lambda. If I go to the application Lambda logs, okay, so you will see a second execution where the transaction ID is empty and it logged the message empty transaction ID. So this must have executed our destination Lambda function. Click on the log group and you will see a single execution history here. Yeah, and if you see, it will log the event that is sent from the application Lambda function. So it will send the request payload, that is actual data that we are sending from the application Lambda, and the error message, that is empty transaction ID.